Claire stood by the kitchen window, watching rain streak down the glass in slow, irregular patterns. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder than it should have been. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched on the marble countertop, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the silence that had become the soundtrack of her marriage. Eric was upstairs, hunched over spreadsheets and quarterly reports, just like every other weekend. He'd been working from home more lately, but it hadn't brought them closer. If anything, the physical proximity only made the emotional distance more obvious. He moved around the house like a ghost, present, but unreachable. Claire glanced at her wedding photo on the hallway table. They looked happy in it, radiant even. But that was 5 years ago, before routine smothered their spontaneity, before their conversations turned transactional, before the passion dulled into mechanical habit. She ran her fingers across the photo frame and sighed. "Hey, anyone home?" The voice startled her. She turned to see Jason, Eric's younger brother, standing in the foyer, his leather jacket damp from the rain. He smiled, shaking droplets from his hair. There was something about him, unpolished yet magnetic, a casual swagger that contrasted starkly with Eric's rigid composure. "Jason," she said, blinking. "I thought you weren't arriving until tomorrow. Caught an earlier flight. Figured I'd surprise you guys." He dropped his duffel bag by the door and offered a hug. Claire hesitated, then stepped into his arms briefly. His scent, a mix of rain, cologne, and something rugged, lingered longer than it should have. "How's the divorce treating you?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Jason shrugged. "Like a root canal, without anesthesia. But hey, silver lining, I get to hang out here for a while and escape the drama." Claire forced a smile. "Well, you're always welcome." Jason's gaze wandered across the living room. "Still got that minimalist touch. You always had an eye for style." "Some things haven't changed," she said, walking toward the kitchen. "Coffee. If it's stronger than my last relationship, yes." His joke earned a small laugh, one that surprised even her. It had been weeks since anything made her laugh genuinely. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen island, she noticed the ease with which Jason spoke. Witty, unfiltered, confident. Where Eric was calculated and reserved, Jason was open and alive. And Claire, starved for connection, found herself leaning in without realizing it. That night, Eric barely acknowledged Jason's arrival. He nodded from his laptop and offered a half-hearted, "Hey bro," before diving back into a financial report. Jason shot Claire a look, eyebrows raised, lips slightly curled in amusement. She couldn't help but smirk back. It was a silent commentary on a truth she tried to ignore. Eric had become a man of numbers, not nuance. Later, as she prepared dinner, Jason leaned against the doorway, watching her slice vegetables. "Eric's lucky," he said casually. "Not every guy gets a wife who's smart, beautiful, and can cook." Claire paused. It wasn't just the compliment, it was the way he said it, direct but sincere. Eric hadn't said anything like that in years. She met Jason's eyes, a flicker of something passing between them. Acknowledgement, curiosity, danger. She quickly turned back to the cutting board. "Flattery won't get you out of doing the dishes." Jason grinned. "Noted. But it doesn't hurt, right?" That evening, Monica called. Claire's best friend never missed a beat. "You sound distracted," Monica said after a few minutes of small talk. "Just tired," Claire replied, though even she didn't believe it. "Is Jason there already?" "Yeah, he came early." There was a pause. "Be careful, Claire." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, emotional gaps don't stay empty forever. Something, or someone always fills them." Claire swallowed hard. "It's not like that." "Not yet," Monica said gently. "But temptation doesn't always walk in wearing a red flag. Sometimes it just smiles and compliments your cooking." After hanging up, Claire lay in bed next to Eric, who was already asleep, one arm draped over his laptop. She stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Downstairs, Jason was probably scrolling through his phone, carefree and charming. The contrast between the two men echoed louder in the silence. She turned off the light, but sleep didn't come. She was thinking about a compliment. Just a compliment. Or so she told herself. Claire woke to the sound of laughter. It was warm, light, and oddly comforting. As she descended the staircase, she found Jason in the kitchen, barefoot and shirtless, flipping pancakes while humming to a retro playlist. "Morning, chef," she said, eyebrows raised. Jason turned, spatula in hand. "Morning, sleeping beauty. I figured it was my turn to feed you." Claire leaned against the counter, trying not to stare at the subtle definition of his arms or the way the sunlight framed his face. She told herself it was just admiration, nothing more. "Eric's already gone?" she asked, scanning the hallway. "Left before sunrise," Jason replied. "Didn't even say goodbye. Guy works too much." Claire offered a neutral smile, but Jason's words echoed her own thoughts. Eric's absences weren't always physical. Sometimes he was in the same room, yet unreachable. She sat down, and Jason placed a plate in front of her. Pancakes topped with strawberries and a drizzle of honey. Simple, but thoughtful. "Wow," she said. "Didn't peg you for the domestic type." Jason chuckled. "Don't let the charm fool you. I've had to learn a few tricks since my ex left." Claire glanced at him, noticing the momentary shadow that crossed his face. "You talk about her a lot." "Habit," he said, shrugging. "Hard to shake off a 6-year mistake." Claire nodded slowly. "Funny how something you once loved can start to feel like a burden." Their eyes met across the table. A beat passed, silent but loaded. That afternoon, Claire wandered into her studio upstairs, trying to distract herself with fabric swatches and paint samples. But nothing held her attention. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Jason's voice, his smile, the pancakes, the way he looked at her like she mattered. Later that evening, Eric returned home, barely uttering a word beyond a tired grunt. He dropped his briefcase, microwaved a leftover meal, and ate in silence while scrolling through emails. Claire watched him from across the room. He hadn't noticed her new dress. He hadn't asked how her day was. He hadn't even touched her. That night in bed, she reached for him, a hesitant hand on his chest. He turned slightly, then mumbled, "Not tonight, Claire. I'm exhausted." She pulled her hand back and turned away. The rejection wasn't new, but it still hurt. The next day, Jason found her in the garden, pruning a dying rose bush. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Just tired," she lied again. Jason crouched beside her. "You don't have to fake it, you know." She looked at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "I'm not faking anything," she said. Jason tilted his head. "Claire, I've been watching you, and not in a creepy way. But you walk around like you're waiting to be noticed. Like you're hoping someone sees you, really sees you." Her hands trembled slightly, the pruning shears slipping in her grip. "I'm fine," she said, standing abruptly. "Thanks for your concern." Jason didn't push further, but his silence said enough. That evening, a sudden power outage left the house cloaked in darkness. Claire lit a few candles, and Jason appeared with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Well," he said with a smirk, "might as well make the most of it." She hesitated, but then sat across from him in the flickering light. The wine flowed, and so did the conversation. Memories, regrets, stories that hadn't seen daylight in years. They laughed, they listened, and slowly, the air between them shifted. At one point, Jason reached across the table, brushing her hand lightly. The contact was brief but electric. Claire froze. Her breath hitched. Jason pulled back, expression unreadable. "Sorry," he said softly. "Didn't mean to cross a line." She didn't respond. She didn't know how to. When the power returned, Claire excused herself quickly, heart pounding as she climbed the stairs. In the safety of her bedroom, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, flushed cheeks, glassy eyes, lips still tingling from a touch that barely happened. Later that night, she dreamed of Jason, his hands on her waist, his voice whispering in her ear. It was vivid, consuming, wrong, and yet, when she woke, her body still ached for what wasn't real. She lay there in the dim light of dawn, torn between guilt and craving. It was just a dream. Just a dream. Or so she told herself. Claire paced the living room in silence, her fingers anxiously fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. Eric had left that morning for a 3-day business trip in Chicago, barely offering more than a peck on her cheek before disappearing out the door. No warmth, no lingering gaze. Just a routine farewell from a man who no longer noticed the woman he was leaving behind. The house felt emptier than usual. Still, Claire tried to fill the space. Laundry, cleaning, watering plants, but nothing dulled the hum of unease beneath her skin. Or anticipation. By early evening, Jason returned from a jog, sweat clinging to his skin, shirt slung over his shoulder. He smiled casually, as if unaware of the storm swirling beneath Claire's composed exterior. "Want me to order something for dinner?" he asked, toweling off his neck. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Sure. Something light." They settled on Thai takeout, the scent of lemongrass and basil filling the kitchen as they sat across from each other. Conversation was light at first, movies, music, childhood stories, but eventually the air thickened, too dense for small talk. Jason poured them both a second glass of wine. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, watching her closely. Claire met his eyes. "Just tired." "No," he said gently. "You're distracted." She opened her mouth to deflect, but the lie caught in her throat. What was the point? Her guard had been eroding for days, her emotions slowly bleeding through the cracks. "Do you ever wonder," she began, then paused. "Wonder what?" "If you made the right choice. If the life you chose is really the one you wanted." Jason leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass. "Every damn day." There was something raw in his voice, honest, exposed. It mirrored the ache she carried but rarely voiced. After dinner, they moved to the living room. A romantic playlist played softly in the background, the candlelight casting shadows on the walls. Claire curled up on the couch, legs tucked beneath her. Jason sat nearby, close enough to feel, not touch. Silence stretched between them. "Claire," he said, voice low. "I don't want to disrespect your marriage, but I need you to know something." She looked at him, heart pounding. "You make it really hard not to want more." The words hit her like a gust of wind. Unexpected, powerful, terrifying. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Jason shifted closer, the space between them shrinking into nothing. His hand reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Claire didn't move. Her breath slowed, her pulse quickened. His fingers slid along her jaw, soft and deliberate. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. She didn't. His lips met hers, slow, exploratory, and deeply familiar in a way that scared her. Her body responded instinctively, aching for affection, for warmth, for something real. The kiss deepened. Hands wandered. In a haze of longing and suppressed emotion, they stumbled toward the bedroom. Clothes fell away in silence, each layer peeled back like a lie. Claire's mind screamed warnings, but her body ignored them. The world had narrowed to touch, to sensation, to need. And then, suddenly, Jason moved too quickly, too eagerly. In the chaos of their desperation, he made a misstep, an awkward, jarring moment. Claire gasped, recoiling instinctively. "Jason, wait, that's..." Realization struck him just as she pushed him away. "Shit. I didn't mean..." Claire pulled the sheet around her, mortified, breath shallow, cheeks burning with embarrassment and shock. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but it wasn't just the physical discomfort. It was the gravity of what had just happened. The act had finally happened, and it was all wrong. She turned away from him, covering her face with trembling hands. This was a mistake. Jason sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, I'm sorry. I didn't." "Please," she said, voice breaking. "Just go." He hesitated, then rose quietly and left the room. Alone, Claire sat on the edge of the bed, every inch of her skin crawling. Guilt curled around her like smoke, thick, suffocating, inescapable. She stood, walked to the bathroom, and turned on the shower. Hot water poured over her body, but it couldn't wash away the shame. She leaned against the tiled wall, eyes closed, heart hollow. Nothing about it had felt right. Not the timing, not the act, not the person. As steam clouded the mirror, Claire caught her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. The days that followed were thick with silence. Jason avoided Claire, staying out late, sleeping in the guest room, barely saying a word beyond surface-level politeness. Claire, meanwhile, drifted through the house like a ghost, haunted not by what had happened, but by how empty it had left her feeling. What disturbed her most wasn't the guilt. It was the absence of satisfaction. The intimacy she had imagined, the spark she had longed for, had ended in confusion and regret. Whatever fantasy she had nurtured with Jason had collapsed beneath the weight of reality. She spent hours alone, revisiting every glance, every word, every moment that had led her down that path. There had been 1,000 opportunities to stop it, 1,000 chances to choose differently. Yet she hadn't. Not because she loved Jason, but because she had felt invisible for so long, she'd started craving any kind of attention. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. By the time Eric returned from his trip, Claire had nearly convinced herself she could bury it all. Pretend nothing had happened. Hide the truth beneath folded laundry and polite dinners. But guilt has a way of seeping into everything. That evening, they sat in the dining room over reheated leftovers. Eric was distracted, skimming emails between bites, his phone vibrating every few minutes. Claire watched him carefully, his face, his posture, the slight furrow in his brow. "Anything important?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Just work," he mumbled. "There's always something." She nodded slowly. "Eric, can I ask you something?" He looked up, mildly surprised. "Of course. When was the last time you really looked at me?" His expression twisted in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, really looked at me. Like I was more than just part of the furniture. Like I mattered." He set his fork down, sighing. "Claire, where's this coming from?" "From the silence. From the way we've become strangers living under the same roof. From the fact that you haven't touched me in weeks." Eric rubbed his temples. "You're overthinking things. Work's been insane lately. I'm doing my best." "No, Eric," she said softly. "You're doing your job. But you stopped being my husband a long time ago." The words hung in the air like fog. Heavy. Cold. Eric stared at her, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Is this about Jason?" Claire's heart stopped. "What?" "I'm not an idiot, Claire," he said quietly. "I've seen the way he looks at you, and how you've been acting. I knew something was off." Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "So you've been watching. But you didn't care enough to ask." "I didn't want to believe it," he admitted. "I kept telling myself it was just my imagination." She hesitated, voice trembling. "Nothing happened the way you think it did." Eric studied her. "But something happened?" Claire didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any confession. Eric stood slowly, the weight of betrayal settling on his shoulders like wet concrete. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just looked defeated. "I can't do this right now," he said, walking toward the hallway. "Eric, please." "No," he said without turning. "I need time." The door clicked shut behind him. Claire sat alone in the dim dining room, surrounded by untouched food and thick regret. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, not from guilt, but from grief. Grief for the marriage that had ended long before any kiss had ever happened. Later that night, Jason returned. His face was unreadable, guarded. "We should talk," he said. Claire nodded. "We should." "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said simply. "This, whatever it was, it shouldn't have happened." "I know. I care about you, Claire. But not like that. Not enough to ruin your life." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Too late." Jason hesitated, then turned to leave. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said softly. "But it's not me." When he left, the house felt colder than ever. Claire stood in the hallway alone, facing the wreckage of choices made too late, words said too little, and a marriage that had cracked long before anyone else stepped into the picture. And for the first time, She wasn't sure if the damage could ever be undone.